For those already here, thank you so much for being here. To the panelists, thank you. And so, welcome to the launch of In Tune, a podcast about music and mental health. My name is Agatoni, with the Arts and Culture Department at the University of Global Health Equity. And before we start with our conversation today, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to share a bit of background on who we are, what we do, and how this podcast came to life. So UGHE is a health sciences university. We're based in Kigali, Rwanda, and our guiding mission is to radically change the way healthcare is delivered around the world. And we have various projects and strategies to this end. And one of the projects is Hamwe Festival. Some of you I see will be familiar with Hamwe. And for those who aren't, Haumea Festival is an annual event and space that was born from, the belief that radical change requires collaboration, in particular collaboration between creative and health sectors. And our most recent event was in November of last year. We held a 5-day virtual festival discussing social justice and mental health from the perspectives of artists, policymakers, medical experts, and so on. And so the engagement during this time gave us a number of insights, including, one, that mental health is a topic that deserves as big a platform as possible. And two, that it is possible even during a global pandemic to sort of bring people together who might share the same goal, the same ideal of a world where the arts are fully recognized, not only as a medium of diversion, but as a tool for education, healing, and so on. And so, yeah, In Tune comes from these insights. It's a 6-part podcast mini-series with conversations with 11 speakers from different parts of the world who share their expertise on a number of topics relating to well-being, including social inclusion, stress, trauma, chronic pain, and more. And so now I'll begin by introducing our panelists. And before I go on, actually, for those of you who've joined, you will see that we have a Q&A box, and if time allows, we'll be receiving questions, but do feel free to drop them in the box as they come along, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this. So I'll start with AZA, one of the speakers who was featured on the podcast. Dr. Aziz Alsop is a first-generation American who grew up in Trinidad. He studied at North Carolina Central University before conducting research in the Thai lab at MIT as part of the Harvard Medical School MIT AIMD PhD program. That's AZA on your screen right now. And AZA studies how social information is computed, integrated, and biased in the brain. His research is guided by the belief that deconstructing these mechanisms will provide a better understanding of how social groups function and offer insights into enhancing the evolution of society at large. AZA also studies music and mindfulness as tools that help enhance wellness and pro-social behavior. And he's also the founder of Renaissance Entertainment, a company that uses music, science, and community building to promote a culture of wellness. He does neuroscience research and provides clinical care as a resident in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University. And our next panelist is Nirei Chanel. And Nirei Chanel is a self-taught artist who believes in the transformational power of music. Nirei, from the early age of 13, began to convey this belief in her songs, releasing her first compositions in 1998 as tribute to the victims of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. In 2019, Nirei recorded her first album, Darota, I Am Dreaming in English, a mixture of modern music and traditional Rwandan rhythms that established her as a recognized and respected voice in Rwanda. Nirei has since shared the stage with many artists, including Neka Gaelfai and Umu Sangahe. She's also director of Ndaho Initiative, a platform that provides psychosocial support to genocide survivors. Our third and final panelist is also someone we featured on the podcast. This is Dr. DeFore Lane, who is joining us today. Dr. Lane is a music therapist and clinician with over 40 years' experience in the field. She's designed and implemented music therapy programs for different populations, including people with mental disability, children who've suffered abuse, geriatric clients, cancer patients, both young and old, and terminally ill patients. Dr. Lane completed a bachelor's degree in vocal performance at the University of Cincinnati Conservatory of Music and began graduate studies at the Curtis Institute of Music. She attended Cleveland State University for her master's degree and earned her PhD in music education from Case Western Reserve University. She also served as Director of Art and Music Therapy at University Hospitals Cleveland. So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. I suppose the question we're asking today is music good for mental health, which is a very broad question. All of those terms can be deconstructed, and in the podcast we attempt to do this at least for music. The first episode asks that question, what is music, and tries to answer by looking at how the very idea of what music is might depend on who you're asking, when you're asking, where you're asking, and the particular function it's playing in that context. A fascinating find for me came from one of our guest speakers, Dr. Ian Cross, who noted that some cultures have one word for singing and playing instruments and dancing. These things that we tend to think of as distinct become the same thing. So my question to all of you, starting with Dr. Lane, is what is music? Very broad, but in your own words, what is music? And has your understanding of this changed across your lifetime?
Indeed. I see personally music as the language of the heart, the mind, the body, and the spirit. I know that's a rather an answer that isn't specific, but literally music speaks to all of those parts of us. It is as complex as the brain will allow it. So I look at the simple concepts of melody, harmony, and rhythm being what embodies music, as well as silence. There has to be that too. But it reaches us in such diverse ways that it makes music possible to address so many of the things that we face from day to day, hour to hour, from phase to phase in our lives. So it's the language of the soul in a way that can be used with intention to address, be it emotional, psychosocial, medical, physical needs that we have. And it does so beautifully.
Thank you. I'll pass the question to you, Chanel. What is music, and has your understanding of music evolved across time?
I think Dr. Lane like said everything. But for me, music is like a universal language, because sometimes you can sing in Kinyarwanda, but someone in Ohio will understand. It is a universal language because we use music um, to talk about love, to talk about peace, to talk about everything in our lives. So for me, music is life.
Right. So music is life. Music is the language of the soul. AZA, what's your take? What is music?
Yeah, I mean, I love both of those kind of definitions because they're really encompassing and broad. I guess the only thing I would add to it is, music is, it's like the basic vibration of energy. Dr. Lane brought up this idea of silence as being like a core part of it. And then out of that silence, vibrations can happen in so many different ways. And the ways that we experience that, I think, and make meaning of that, music is, I think music in its most broad sense can kind of be everything that kind of vibrates and that we can hear and feel in that way, and how we make sort of order in it. And this idea that while it is universal in its kind of core components, it can find very specific cultural expression and very individual, expression. So you take this universal thing that can then be kind of molded to really express one's individuality.
Thank you. And Dr. Lane, you mentioned something interesting, this, idea of psychosocial support, and sticking to the topic of definitions. So mental health, we understood mental health throughout this podcast, and this is a definition we borrowed from the World Health Organization as something that includes emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And I don't know if I'm correct in thinking this, but it seems as though this movement to understanding something like mental health as something that isn't just individual, but something, it places the individual in their context, seems to be something that has happened gradually. And maybe that assumes that we've arrived. Maybe we haven't. So maybe I'll start with you, Dr. AZA. So how has the understanding of mental health or our approach to it changed? Are we more inclusive now of people and their contexts and their environments, their cultures, in how we treat and diagnose mental health?
Yeah, I would say that it's moving in the right direction, right? So I think a lot of the ways that we think about, let's say, psychiatry, in the way that psychiatry as a vehicle for meeting sort of community and individual mental health, we think about like the biopsychosocial model, which talks about there's like a biology that is a part of this, there's a psychology, but then the social element and really thinking about what environment is someone in, what family, what context, I think is something we're thinking a lot more now about when we think about cultural formulation, really understanding the experiences someone's happening through the lens of their culture. These are things that are now really becoming, I think, more at the forefront of how we think about not only understanding people's experiences and how that leads to difficulties with their mental health, but then how we might be able to intervene in ways that actually empower that, that person in front of us to achieve, their goals for their mental health. So I think we're moving in that direction, but the data still shows that there are many different disparities based on a number of different social criteria and categories, race being a huge one in the United States.
Thank you. Dr. Lane, what's your take? You've practiced for, as I said, over 40 years as a music therapist and clinician. Has there been an observable shift?
Absolutely. And don't you keep harping on 40 years. It makes me feel like I'm 100 years old, so be careful with that. Yes, when I first started, music therapy as a profession was really not very well known. However, um, the impact of music for the different people that I first started to work with. I started initially with developmentally disabled children and adults from about 4 to 22 years of age, severe multi-handicaps or moderate. Some of them could not talk, a lot on the autism spectrum, etc. But music, as Nirei said, spoke to them in their own language so beautifully. Um, I would watch a child who was without words; he could not verbalize, but when he wanted more music, when I would sing to him, you knew what he was trying to say something. So my intention was to give him the language to say, I want more. And in sign language, this means more. So I would simply stop the music that I knew he was enjoying and rocking to and say, do you want more? And I would take his hands and shape them, and he would respond. Um, And pretty soon he began to do it, initiate it on his own. So I, and in terms of, so giving people voice, that was one thing I wanted to do, give him a means of communicating. But once I was very comfortable with 247 children in this developmental center, but people in the community were not. And the whole idea of social justice and making people more aware and comfortable with and able to see more than a person with autism or Down syndrome. I took them caroling at a huge mall where I would teach them songs with sign, and they would literally go out and I'd say, now that we've sung this song, go and get somebody in the audience who's watching us standing around and bring them back. And I think the idea of a child going and taking the hand of someone, giving them one of their instruments to play while we sang Jingle Bells or I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, a person begins to see with different eyes. And I think we can use our music to bring about those changes. And in the healthcare field, yes, more and more music therapists now are being hired in hospitals, hospices, clinics around the world. So it does take time, but it is happening.
Great, thank you. And so, this makes me think of you're talking about the children, go and bring someone. There is a sense of perhaps a big statement to make, but healing seems to happen in connection or even in community, whether it be in connection to you as a music therapist or connecting to other people. And so, Dr. Aziz, I'll come back to you. Your work in particular looks at the importance of this, of community, and how music supports pro-social behavior. A broad question, why does coming together matter? And how does music facilitate this?
Yeah, and I'm gonna try not to get too down the rabbit hole because it's a question that I'm really excited about. But I'll say broadly speaking, if we just look at it from a biological perspective, I think there's this drive to come together because we needed that to survive, literally, right? Like we needed to be able to fit within a social group and have that advantage of that social cohesion in order to survive, our early ancestors. And so I think there's a biological drive for being able to fit within a social milieu. I think spiritually there's a drive for us to kind of transcend ourselves, and there's something about connecting with another person and seeing both, again, this idea, when we come back to this idea of music kind of being a microcosm for life, seeing both the universality as well as the individual expression that comes out of that, I think it's another powerful force. I think music plays a role in this. I mean, there are theories that music's initial sort of role in human society was that of communication. And that, like, from the very beginning, the reason why we were making noises on different things, beating out these initial rhythms and then using different intonations was all about how do we refine communication and how do we connect to people, leave messages in ways that otherwise might be difficult. And so I think music in that way, and if we think of it evolving in this way, I think it's clear that it has this communicative role. Even when we're not performing for someone, we're expressing something that can then be received and can be communicated. And so I think that's another big way in which music sort of helps to drive social cohesion. We now study this, in the lab, and a lot of different groups have seen that you can kind of drive these different pro-social behaviors with music.
Thank you. And, I mentioned earlier that when you're trying to come up with a definition of music, some people tend to look at, as Dr. Lane did, the structure, and others tend to look at the functions, one of which is, as you say, communication, connection, bringing people together. There seems to be a role that hasn't changed over time. So coming together seems to matter for everyone, but especially perhaps for people who've encountered traumatic events, who feel isolated. And in our episode on managing pain and trauma with music, one of our guest speakers, Beata Shaka, points at how important it can be to externalize traumatic events, to speak, to connect, to join, to be with others. And I think Nirei, this is exactly the work you do with Daho Initiative, and also with your music. So could you tell us a bit more about this, how your music and the platform you've created, connects people, and what the inspiration for that was?
Daho was initiated after my new song, which is unfortunately not yet out. It is called Araho, which means she's there. So in this song, I want to talk about the survivors. Because when I started singing, my first songs I released in 1998 was about the paying tribute to the victims. And it was also a way for me to maybe to put words on what I witnessed as a child of 9 years old. And when we are in a commemoration period, we somehow we go back we go back to what happened. But within our initiative, I want to talk about the survivors, what happened in what they face in their daily lives, how they deal with the consequences of the cruelty that they lived. So Ndaho was a place to reminisce about the good things about their loved ones, and to think of the good times they used to spend together. And somehow I thought that was another way of keeping them alive, and saying how they are doing now, because now means I am here or I'm alive. So it was a place to say, I'm here, I survived, now I have started, I got a degree now, I got married, I even have kids, even though they won't see you, grandma, granddad. So it was like a letter to those who are up there, and a space also to be able to speak of the grief that people face in their daily lives when they get married, but they feel like they don't want to do it because their parents won't see, they're not there. When they have kids, they bear children who won't see their cousins, their uncles and aunties. But what we wanted also was to provide therapy sessions. And I was lucky to partner with Beyond the Veil and Sana Initiative, who provided like psychotherapists for a whole week of commemoration. And even now, if people write to us and they need help, there is always a psychologist who can talk to them, and I'm so grateful to those people who are working with me. Yeah. And so yeah, so this was supposed to be I don't know, Araho was a sort of in the engine of the campaign, so it didn't happen. But I was lucky because during the first edition of Hamwe Festival, I was on another campaign called Atura, which is Atura means break the silence, and this song was about domestic violence. So people knew how I used the song, so they joined in, and like I'm shaking because it always connects with people, and that it's something that we need. And maybe we didn't know that it was therapeutic. I don't know, because we didn't have the scientific, the words to put on it. But music had been a main tool since 1994 for Rwandans to go through the pain and to be able to put words on this atrocity, unimaginable, horrific thing that happened to sing in Rwanda. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nirei. Um, and I think I will ask you again, sticking with you, and I will ask this question to everyone. So you're all doing these things that are, music therapy. You are, in a sense, giving to others, and at the same time, all of you are artists. So I'm sure there's that sense that, music gives you something extra, so to speak, or perhaps, is there something distinct, you think, in creating music that is different, for example, than to listening to music? Starting with you, Nirere, when you make music, say when you're stressed, what does that feel like? What is that process for you?
Um, when I make music, or like the song Atura o Arahu, there is something big that happens that is beyond me, and somehow I get to get through it through words and the melody. I don't know if it's clear. If it's something that I feel like helpless, I like the song of about domestic violence. It was about something that I witnessed, but I couldn't do something, and so I want to scream, but in our culture you have to be contained, you see. But in the song I can scream, so that's the end of the song. I really scream. You see, so and yeah, and I think it helps me. I don't know. Somehow you see things at a large scale, and somehow you see things that you cannot even explain sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's a good point. That was one of the sort of concluding points on that episode on what is music. In the end, we just concluded, we might need to, synthesize evidence for the purposes of science and research, and say a practice like music therapy. But, in the end, music is something that you doesn't need to be understood to be made or to be enjoyed. And that's a good point. So I will turn to you, Dr. Lane, because this is all of the things we've been talking about, in a way, relate to stress. And you could say stress is the meeting point for very many mental health disorders, whether it be chronic pain, that can be a stressor, social exclusion, a stressor. Stress is also linked to depression and anxiety. And so we feature you on the episode on music and coping, and you share various, you know, moments where you've used music for both self-soothing or when you've observed music, just stress go down in people in response to music. Could you share a bit about those experiences?
Certainly. I identify so closely with what Neri was saying. I describe it like this, Neri. I felt when I was in opera, when I sang opera, that the music and me and the audience became one. And when that happened, it was not something I could put into words. Music did that for me. Um, and then when I began when I saw that it could go beyond the stage, beyond where I was, that people with mental stresses or deficits or disabilities could equally enjoy it, but in their way. I had to find a way to take the music then and give it to them in a way that met their need or calmed their heart or gave them peace of mind. So it felt like God had kind of unscrewed my head, poured in this beautiful thing called music, put my head back on and said, okay, now go and use it. Do what you what music can do. And because it's both an art and a science, um, I be I believe that uh, we have a phrase here that says it takes a worried man to sing a worried song. Um, you walked a road of watching a very traumatic situation. I too have had issues in my life. Cancer twice has been one of them. I miscarried a child. That was one of them. And I can truly say that working in a hospital then for 40 years after these things or in conjunction with these things gave me a different perspective and a mindset to use. I still have music, it's still in me. Those things can coexist. You mentioned the joy, the scream. Those things are not, um, oh, I can't think of the phrase, mutually exclusive. You can have both. And I think the psychiatrist in you, Asa, can help us put those things together, can help us see that we are more than the trauma. And that's what I love about the music. I used it to help me fall asleep because my mind was racing a million miles a minute. I used it, Nirei, to compose. I wrote a song to say, this is what I'm thinking and feeling. And I think people listened with different ears. I could sing with a different mindset because I'd walked a mile in those shoes. So I think that the encompassing value of being able to use what's in us, the beauty of music, the voice that we have, the instrumental abilities can all be used to comfort, to provide care, to provide expression. And yes, it's very therapeutic as well. So I'd better stop. I really want to hear what Dr. AZA has to say about this.
Dr. AZA, take it away.
No, I was saying everything that you both have said, resonates so much. I did really, I mean, for me, music, my first exposures to music really were in the spiritual framework, and seeing how music is used within the church as I think a very powerful tool to not only bring people into a certain state, but also to provide like a vehicle for catharsis and release of emotion and synchronizing people at the same time. And this is all like very ancestral, coming back to like the practices that, initiated in Africa, and where you see music being very much embedded, not just into the spirituality, but sort of the entire life process. And so the idea of like the unity that happens between sort of the observer, the music, and the receiver, this idea of like having these experiences that are kind of like outside of yourself. I think music is such a great tool and vehicle because it does have this spiritual component to it to kind of bring us into a certain space that we can then figure out is really a representation of like life itself. And so I think music can be very central to healing because it provides a window and a door into sort of not only experiencing and having a vehicle for our own emotions, but giving us sort of a window into this world that exists kind of outside of our sort of egoic identities. And I think it's one of the most powerful tools that we have, to be able to experience that kind of firsthand, and then apply it to other areas of our life.
That's interesting. It reminds me of in one of our episodes, we invite Dr. Hao Wang, who is a pianist, among other things. And one of the points he was making was that unity can be physically expressed. For example, when people are all experiencing a trance in a drumming session, and their heartbeat sort of matches to that rhythm, and so everyone, in a sense, is having an individual, but sort of spiritual and communal experience. And so I think at this point, I will take one question from the Q&A, just because it sort of ties in with what I'd like to ask you. And I will address this to Dr. Lane. So Gatabazi says that, you know, he understands that people are emotionally wired, but he's not quite clear on how music therapy works essentially. How do therapists choose the music for treatment? And, you know, so I wonder if you can explain that, Dr. Lane. Walk us through how, you know, a typical, or I doubt there's a typical session, but what does that look like when someone comes into your practice? How do you treat them, if that's the right word? How do you interact with them? What techniques do you use?
The literature says that the music we respond to most is the music we like best. How we use that with intention is what music therapists do. I know that the brain responds to music whether we want it to or not. If I play Michael Jackson in the operating room, it's going to have an effect on that surgeon, believe me. So I know there are certain things that aren't warranted too. I recently, within the last, I'd say 20 years, neurologists have become more and more aware of how they can affect the body through music. We've used PET scan, MRIs, CAT scans to look at how the brain is responding to music that we like. You mentioned drumming, how music can entrain our heart rate, our respiration rate, simply by superimposing the same, let's say my heart is racing at 120 beats per minute. Well, if I start playing something that's about 60 to 80 beats per minute, eventually this fast heartbeat is going to entrain with the music that I'm playing or the drum beat that the body simply responds because the brain picks up on those vibrations, as Aziz said. Also with pain perception, I work with cancer patients a lot, and many have experienced great pain. One of the things that I love doing is asking, what song do you like the most? What does it bring to mind? Is it Sia hamba kukandeni kwinko sia hamba, or is it something like then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee, or we just have a little talk with Jesus and he'll tell him all about. You can find a song that has meaning because it has memory of a particular time, a particular person, an incident that brings it all back. And our bodies cannot tell the difference often when things are actually happening versus when we're simply thinking about them and mindfully being in that place. You can bring about the same endorphin release, serotonin, those body's natural opiates by simply triggering it with the music. So what do? I ask a person, if we're here because you are in pain, then I'm going to try to ask you about the music that brings you that sense of relaxation and peace. And then I'll try to move you closer to that state. If I'm with a young woman who wants to feel more self-confident, I might take some of Nieri's music and say, girl, you want to hear something that's empowering and that's going to go straight, you know, to the jugular? Here's what I want you to listen to. And let me tell you about her and why. So it really depends on what the person's need is, how the music therapist can use some of the neurologic music therapy techniques to get to that, and then develop relationship. I really believe that's very important. I'm not going to tell you to listen, to this 10 times and go home, call me in the morning. I'm going to be there with you. I'm going to work with you to understand and move forward. So a session, you're right, looks very different, but by using all of the things that we know that music can trigger, we can pull it together in order to reach that person in a way that's meaningful to them.
Thank you, Dr. Lane Gatawazi. I hope that answered your question. And Dr. Lane, you talked about music therapy, and in our conversation prior to this, you defined this as, in a number of ways, and I'll ask you to repeat that. But one thing I do remember is that it being evidence-based. And so I wonder what the importance of this is, because someone might say, look, I use music to self-soothe, you use music, music can be something we choose at home, or on the way to work, earphones. So where does music therapy come in essentially? At what point does music therapy offer something that is, unique?
I believe the research and the literature are very important. We value in the field of medicine what we can measure. It brings credibility to what we're doing. I can tell a story that talks about what music is and its effects, but a doctor I've seen want facts. They want graphs. They want measures that say, okay. So what I did was to walk into the Department of Anesthesiology, and I said simply, what could I show you by my using music that would make a difference to you? I know patients want relief. I know families want their patients to be treated with compassion, but as an anesthesiologist, what do you want? And they were pretty accurate. They said, number one, if I could use less anesthesia, that's better for the patient. So if you can use music in a way that lowers the amount of anesthesia I need, so they're not on the table as long. Some of the other physicians and surgeons were more concerned about the anxiety of the patient. They're going in so anxious, and the more relaxed you are, the better things can work for the patient and for the surgeon. One surgeon just told me, please, if you can do something to make the patient stop talking, that would help me. But don't repeat that. So one of my research studies happened to do with women who were undergoing breast biopsies, breast surgeries. They literally had to be given anesthesia to detect whether this mass was cancerous or not. And they were all ages. And I wanted to look at patient satisfaction. That's really big here in the United States now, because it means reimbursement. So it means money. Number two, I wanted to know if the use of music could lower the anxiety levels of patients before going into surgery. And yes, how that would help the use of anesthesia. So we did a randomized controlled trial. We used live music. Yes, I had to get up at 6:30 in the morning and get into the surgery before the patient was taken into the OR. And I had asked them prior, tell me the song that you think would make you feel most relaxed and encouraged. I had to learn that song. And if they were in the group that was live, I literally stood beside their bed and sang it and took my keyboard and played it with them. And then for those who were randomized to the group of that was recorded music, I found their artist that they liked most, put it on an iPod, and they were able to listen to it beforehand. And pre and post, one of the nurses took their anxiety levels. Of course, I didn't want to do that because they'd be partial to me. And what we found was there was significant decrease in levels of anxiety. This was 200 patients now undergoing breast biopsies who they significantly had their anxiety reduced. I mean, the value was 0.01. So that's pretty cool. For patient satisfaction, out of the wazoo. That's not scientific language, but everybody, because they were getting personal attention. Those who had the recorded music lessened their anxiety as well, but not to the same extent that the live did. And I was grateful for that too, in a way. But it also shows you that there is a room for a person to pre-record music, take it with them, and to be soothed by it. And the evidence has shown us in many studies that less anesthesia is necessary, less pain medicine is necessary. In ours, unfortunately, we used something called a BIS monitor, which was not accurate throughout the surgeries, and so we could not look at that. However, one thing we did find was patients who had the music therapy were discharged sooner than those patients who did not have it. So all the way around, we feel that we can bring evidence to the table that music can make a difference, both monetarily, both physically, certainly psychologically. And the doctors were really pretty pleased too. They thought we were going to get in their way and we would delay things. So I learned to work quickly, to sing fast, and to get in there in time so that things could move along. We also know that doctors make fewer mistakes when they use music for themselves in the OR. So I had to make sure the patients were using music through earphones and not circulating through their ear. And that research was done with doctors adding numbers for accuracy, not actually doing surgery. So yes, we can bring the science and we can bring the experience of music together, the artful experience of it in healthcare to make a tremendous difference.
Wonderful. Thank you. And, you know, I think the evidence appears to be stronger, I think, than most people think. One of our guest speakers, Dr. Tasha Golden, she, you know, had a scoping review basically on how music can be used to treat or mitigate the symptoms of serious mental illness. And the finding recently published was that 2/3 of the studies reported that music was helpful, was useful, with none of the studies actually reporting adverse effects. And on the topic of research, I think, Dr. Aziz, what you do is, particularly interesting on two levels. I think the research, who you research essentially, and also how you deliver that research. Do you mind sharing a bit about that? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, when it comes to that research, there are two things I'm doing. One is looking at how music mindfulness intervention. So there's music that's been created to be supportive of mindfulness, and then delivered with mindfulness instructions in a virtual setting in the community. And we're looking, at people of African descent who not only, pretty much suffer from disparities across the board when it comes to health outcomes, but also have had limited access to not just these tools, but also the research studies, really underrepresent people of color in general, but I'm particularly interested in people of African descent. And so the research aims to look at how sort of these various virtual tools can be used to deliver these sorts of interventions in a community setting at very low cost. I think the power of that is really that it's being done from a framework which is then able to readily interpret those results and then apply it within the field. And so I don't think any of the things that we find, I think using sort of the Western medical framework isn't really giving us, I think, new information. It's just putting it within a framework that's being that can be accepted. And I think that's then important because there can be resources and infrastructure that then goes behind it. A part of that also is like figuring out the mechanism. How does this actually work? How does certain chord progressions, for instance, certain tonalities change the way in which the brain, responds in different ways? Again, these are ideas that you can trace, back to Kemet, which then like the Greeks and Romans and a lot of classical era kind of built on. But these are all ideas, I think, when we can figure out mechanisms for them and do them in a community-based way, it then gives sort of credence to get resources and infrastructure to employ these things, more widely in society.
Thank you. I will take another question at this point. And I do hope that that answered Margaret's question, who was asking, what approach would you use to merge music with health education in communities? So the work Dr. Aziz is doing is, the research is being done directly in the communities that he's hoping to serve. And so we've talked a bit about community being pro-social. And in a way, we've touched on this topic, but I'd like to bring it to focus now. And this question, I think I will focus it to Nirei. And this question is coming from Elise. We've talked about music driving pro-social behavior, but what do the panelists think about music being a very individual expression for healing, music just for self? And this is a topic that we do cover on the podcast, and we look at how music, helps a range of things. We've mentioned self-expression. Dr. Lane, you mentioned confidence, and there are other things, a sense of agency. And so, if Nirei, you can take that question. So you all look at community, but just once again, what does music do for the individual outside of that?
I think music help us go through different phases of lives, loss of a beloved person. Music has helped me go through a breakup, and sometimes I can use someone else's music and not just my music. And I've seen people being able to speak for the first time because they had a word that speaks to them in a song. I think it helps us in all different phases of lives. It's so, yeah. It's vague, but that's that's how it was. But personally, it helped me in breakup, in sorrow, in loss, in speaking to someone. Like Atura, I'm talking to someone to break up the silence because I cannot change things for someone if that someone is not ready to work to speak up, even to get justice. Sometimes it's something that I witnessed as well, because you can go to, I don't know, to police or other institutions saying, I know that someone is being abused, or but if that someone is not able to come to speak for herself, they won't accept sometimes. Yeah, so I've been able to talk about things thanks to a song, and I've seen people being able to speak thanks to a song.
And I wonder if Dr. Azia, you'd be willing to share kind of that just, I remember this is one of the topics we talk about. Is it even worth talking about, say, the individual and community? How does, music help, the individual integrate into themselves and not just integrate into the community? And is the distinction worth making?
Yeah. So, I think the distinction is worth making up to a point, and then it's not. But I think music, it can certainly be a way for us to express ourselves individually. And there's this sort of self-healing that can happen, not only in just expressing our truth, our authenticity, in a way that is unafraid and in a way that really resonates. And even hearing back what we've created can be, a tool for not just self-reflection, but the healing that can come about as a result of that. But I think really thinking about ourselves as individuals and not as a part of a community really misses a huge part of who we are, as humans, and how we're sort of meant to function. We talked about it from a biological perspective as well as a spiritual perspective, but there's this drive in us to want to connect, and to connect with other life forms, to connect with other consciousness. And so I think music really is, it's sort of a meeting place for that, where again, people from different cultures, different languages can all tap into this same kind of fundamental source and use it to communicate with each other and use it to actually form community and culture around. I mean, there's certain kind of ways of living that are almost, embodied with a certain kind of music, and the culture of how those people live is very much tied to the music. And I think even if you look at the history of like people of African descent in the US and in the West, our music evolves as our experiences are evolving as a community, and as we're shaping new ways of being. We have jazz evolve out of that, hip hop evolve out of that, gospel. And so I think really music can be this way of not just finding this internal sense of expression, but then using that to then find how that fits into community. And I think there's a supreme amount of wellness and healing that happens when we can not only find our authentic expression, but then also find how that fits into community.
All right, so now as we conclude, we've been asking you questions, but it's possible you have something to say that maybe, hasn't been touched on. And I wonder if you have any closing remarks. This can be anything you would like to add on what's been said, or even a sense of, looking forward, what is the ideal then, once music is integrated, say, as a healthcare practice, or, once music is researched among various groups of people, what is the end goal? What is the vision? I'll start with you, Dr. Lane.
Sitting here trying to put something in a succinct way. I used to think that I had nothing to bring to the table but a song. And in a world of healthcare and hospitalization and codes and, $25 words that I don't even understand, and people who are going through crisis, who are nearing death, who are receiving diagnosis and they don't know what the future holds. What in the world, Deforia, do you think music can do in those situations? I can't do surgery, I can't cure it, but what I could do truly was amazing even to me when I saw how a simple song could change the environment, could change the mood, could close a person's eyes so they could rest, could bring down the tension. I stopped asking that question. I stopped beating myself over the head. To be able to have the privilege of singing to a person who is taking their last breath is an awesome time. It is a true privilege. To be able to walk into the room of a person who's just come out from brain surgery and they're waiting for them to open their eyes to see what's left. What are they going, will they recognize me? Will they be able to speak? What will happen? And to watch that person open their eyes and instead of saying anything, they began to sing the song that we had done together right before they fell asleep in surgery. To be able to compose a song with a woman who knew her days were numbered, but she wanted to tell me how much her daughter meant to her. And I sang that song to her daughter in the presence of the woman who had just written it. And I watched them hold hands and hug each other, and how meaningful that was to both of them. And then to be able to sing that song at her funeral and to tell people how music was the vehicle for her to show her love for her daughter. I am amazed at this gift called music. I have used it in ways that, as I said, surprise me. So I would just say to anyone listening, don't underestimate the value of your voice, of what one song or some lyrics can do. It truly is a gift beyond measure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lane. And same question to you, Nirei. Any comments that you would like to add on what you've spoken about, or more generally, what's the vision? What do we hope comes of this work at the intersection of music and mental health?
I hope that people get to be aware of the effects of the music, because as Dr. Lane said, there is some sort of assurance and comfort when it comes from a doctor, because some music is just music. So these tune-in conversations, I hope they continue to happen, because I have learned a lot today. And what I wish for people who deliver the music is to continue to have the force, the light, the strength, because sometimes the messages of certain healing songs are very heavy to bear. So I think my last word would be to wish more power and light to the people who deliver the songs.
Thank you, Nirei. And finally to you, AZA. What is the ideal? What is the hope? What are you hoping to achieve with this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're in a really incredible time for our society, where we are seeing that a lot of sort of the structures that we thought were so rigid aren't actually that rigid, and they can change a lot, and we have a lot of power to do that. And I think music has always been sort of at the forefront of human change, art in general, and music as one particular, I think, powerful form of art. And so I think in today's society, as we are undergoing these processes of transformation, I think we have to really think about the role music is going to play. I'm excited that there's a podcast like this. I'm excited about the work that my co-panelists are doing, and people really all around the world who are really starting to take back some of this power that, again, we've known for a very long time, and kind of lost our way with, you know, a lot of the structures that we've kind of built in society. And so to me, what's most exciting is now how we're bringing back a lot of this old knowledge, putting it into these structures to transform them. And I think as a result, you know, society will be transformed. So it's exciting.
Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for making the time to speak today. Very excited to catch you, AZA and Dr. Lane, on the podcast. The podcast will be available on various platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Captivate. Have a listen. Keep this conversation going. Send us your question on our social media, and also find this conversation on our social media, our website, and YouTube. Our Instagram handle should be on the screen, and we're also on Twitter. Always receptive to questions. And yes, so thank you so much, everyone, and goodbye.